The other way that you're going to start to lay in premise is going to be through dialogue, but that will come a little bit later. We'll talk about that on our next story point, which brings us to our next story point. Now that we have established all of these settings, characters, and images starting to link into our premise, we are ready for the story point that is the call to action. Let's write that just a little bit more clearly. The call to action is specifically a call to your protagonist to act. So you can very easily remember the call to action is a call to the protagonist to act. It is also called the inciting incident. The inciting incident is that moment that thrusts the character into the action, the dramatic action. Inciting is to incite. This the same way as excite is to excite from outside. Something has come outside and it's excited you. Insight is something from the inside that brings you up, that calls you, that wakes you. And then the incident means that it's one particular moment in time. One incident. Just as our status quo is a particular scene, so too our call to action is a particular scene. So there's a particular scene in which your protagonist is called into action, in which your antagonist is incited with that particular incident. That is what we understand for our call to action. The definition that I absolutely want you to memorize and have locked in your mind is that the character is thrust into action to go after their goal. The call to action, the inciting incident, the definition is the character is thrust into action to follow their goal or desire. Remember, for our internal character, for a character that has internal, a passive character, they're going to be following a desire, looking to fulfill a desire. But you can, the words speak for itself for really remembering what and how this scene works. Once we have that call to action, and this is that moment in the film where, for example, in kind of our Civil War moment, that we're the close of the Civil War scene that we're looking at, we had the character, she was out on the runaway, Underground Railroad, and she misses getting a letter saying that the war is over. That's where we begin. There is a particular call to action. And now she's, in addition to that, there needs to be a specific moment or incident where she's told, here's where you're going to reach the Mason-Dixon line and be in the north. You simply have to go through that field or cross that, cross that fence. Something that's very specific and particular. Just so that we have a couple of hypothetical examples going so we can see how this works in many different films. If we were to have an action film where a cop is, we're opening and establishing his world. So he's a cop, present day, New York. And he is chasing, our opening scene shows him chasing a guy who's just robbed a bank, So he's on this is his life. This is the status quo of his life. We see that the characters around him, his sergeant, his partner, the antagonist. We'll see the antagonist as a character that's developed, the guy who's robbing the bank. We'll see those characters being developed. We'll see then for our cop, our protagonist, that his objective is perhaps to be the best cop on the force. And then we have, which is a desire, not a specific objective. So we could decide, let's as we imagine him more, what do we imagine as a specific objective? It could be that this particular bank robber, this particular thief has eluded him. And so his overriding objective, his objective goal is to capture this particular criminal. That's specifically who he's after. We can see that his flaws are, in a typical action film, his flaws might be that he's an alcoholic. So while he's the best cop, his strength, he is an alcoholic, his flaw. Then when we have his call to action could be that just as this antagonist narrowly escapes him again, he's called into his sergeant's office. And his sergeant, so now we're going to go into a specific scene, and his sergeant has men in black suits in the room with him. And those men in black suits say, we're members of the CIA, and the guy that you've been chasing is a terrorist, and you've gotten the closest to capturing him. We want you to capture him for us. Very specific call to action. Now he has something specific to do, which is in line with his objective, but it's very specific. He's either going to take it or he's not going to take it. This period of time here, as we go between the call to action before we exactly hit into Act 2 is the protagonist deciding whether he or she will accept the call to action, whether they actually want to take on this task. For our cop, we can't see why he may wonder, but he might have some reservations. In a dialogue that he has with either his partner or the sergeant about whether he'll accept that call to action is also going to bring in premise, because he's going, whatever that character's reservations are going to then start to elevate what we were laying down or where our imagination was taking us in regards to the premise. So the premise at the call to action is also defined or explored and conveyed through dialogue. So we have two ways that we're establishing our premise: through images that we've begun way from the beginning with maybe even most often our first image, and with dialogue. Dialogue throughout, but absolutely dialogue here. In this part is where in our dialogue we are seeing a lot of subtext. Subtext is that which exists underneath the text. That's which we understand to be what someone is meaning, but which they're not saying specifically in their words. So instead of someone saying, we have people in a horror film, there's a dark room they're supposed to enter, instead of someone saying, I'm afraid to enter that dark room, which is flat dialogue, we go, what, who is this person? We're all of a sudden disinterested. But if he had said, it's really dark in there, all of a sudden his fear is subtext. He didn't say it. It's not text. He didn't say, I'm afraid. He simply said, it's really dark in there. But what we understand him to be saying, what's underneath that text, is that he's afraid. And that's more interesting to us because that's, as human beings, how we talk. Very rarely does your friend say, I'm really worried about this test. Instead, the friend says, I hate when we have to take these tests. They don't say, I'm worried about it. They don't say, I'm nervous about it. They say, I hate the test. They say, our teacher's stupid. They don't say, I don't understand what our teacher's saying. And the reason why subtext is subtext is very often we're not aware. It's very much something that we're not aware of what we're feeling or what we're saying. We simply have a reaction to something, negative or positive. We're attracted to something or we're repulsed by something. We don't exactly know why. And that subtext is the why. So here in your Act 1, much of your dialogue, a lot of your meaning, a lot of what your character really wants and really feels is all going to be underneath in the subtext. So that's what we're getting here as the character decides. Now, if we had so our action film is a objective character. Our protagonist has the objective of catching this criminal, and now his call to action is saying that the guy is a terrorist, and do you want to join the CIA in their hunt for this terrorist? Then you also have a passive character, a character who maybe just has desires. Their call to action is going to be a little bit different. Their call to action may be internal. So, for example, we have a priest who, in the status quo, he has been in the monastery. He's been more of an academic priest, kind of studying the philosophy of the Catholic Church, and now he's being moved into a parish. His call to action could be, his bishop saying to him, we want to move you into this particular parish. And that priest may actually have more of a debate, an internal debate, of whether that matches his desire, which is simply to be a good man. And he has this thing inside of him driving him to be just a good man. And he's beginning to doubt that. He's beginning to think that he's not a good man by everything that he's studied and everything that he's learned as being a priest. That now the very fear of acting in a parish, of going and taking all that he's learned and being active about it, gives him such fright. Well, this isn't an external necessarily conflict that he has. This is internal. This is on his own fear. This is something that's driving the inside of him. So for that particular character, his dialogue, the subtext that his dialogue is going to reveal and tap into a premise is going to be much more deeper than necessarily for the action hero. The action hero is simply going to say, gee, I don't know, I'm chasing a criminal is different from chasing a terrorist. So his dialogue and getting into his, premise is going to be very different than an internal character and their dialogue and getting into the premise of that particular film. But as we're leaving our call to after our call to action, we have a period in which the character contemplates accepting it. Both a passive character and an active character contemplates it, although the passive character's contemplation usually tends to be a bit more rife with uncertainty than the active character. We then will have them accepted, and this period where they accept it launches them into Act 2. So we begin Act 2 once the protagonist has accepted their call to action. In Act 2, we have a rise in our action. Because they've accepted this call, they're going to continue. We'll see that this arc will continue to rise for their attempt. At the top of this is their attempt. Now, in most of life, we don't usually get what we set out for the first time. So with our cop, he goes after the terrorist. He gets the terrorist on the first time. He goes out, shoots him in the head, and then he's done. End of story. That's the kind of story that we may go, why did you tell me that story? That wasn't interesting. It's back to our example at a party where a friend goes, oh, this day I tried to go out to the grocery store and I was going to get this candy bar, and I got a candy bar. And you're like, dude, what was that about? Why did you tell me that story? Why did I need to know that? Okay, fine, great, thanks. I'm going to go talk to so-and-so now. That's that same thing. For whatever reason, as Aristotle observed, that's not a strong imitation of life. Even from being a child, as we talked about in class, that even a kid is crying over something. What's a kid got to cry for? They're 5 years old, they're fed, they're clothed, everything they need is given and provided to them. But if that kid doesn't get a candy at that particular moment in time, and his mom says, no, wait till after dinner, the kid is in turmoil. The kid is doing a temper tantrum. The kid is all apart and in pieces, all because they just didn't get a piece of candy. So it's the human experience that tells us when we don't get something, when we try for something, we don't get it. The human experience tells us that and shares that kind of collective experience. So that's what we actually want to do in our stories. We want our stories to speak to a truth. So we're going to actually see that our protagonist does not get what he wanted in the first try. So where he is here is our first fall. This first fall is a particular obstacle that has caused the character not to achieve their goal. This obstacle could be an antagonist. So in our action film, why didn't the protagonist get the terrorist? Because the antagonist himself escaped the situation. He's his main obstacle. The antagonist is providing the obstacles and difficulties for the protagonist to achieve their goal. For our priest, his first obstacle may be that he went to the parish and that he was his first interaction with reconciliation. He's doing well, people are coming in and receiving the sacrament, and then he gets one person that comes in, perhaps an older man that comes in, that says, Father, please forgive me for I have sinned. I no longer believe in God. And for our priest, he maybe fumbles over counseling this person because his own faith is being challenged. So his first fall, his fear, his anxiety that he had to accepting going out and being an active priest instead of a priest studying in a monastery has already failed. He's not doing a good job. And that man might leave and share his experience with, say that was an older man, and he shares his experience with his daughter. His daughter comes to the priest and says, I cannot believe that you told my father who is suffering from cancer or suffering from pancreatic failure or something, where this or kidney failure, where my grandfather is near death and comes to you and says that he doesn't know to believe that he believes in God, and you as a priest simply say, yeah, I don't know either. Like, this woman could be irate. This would be a complete expression of this priest's failure to be a spiritual leader in the community where he's at. So that's going to be, a kind of obstacle. Now, that's not an obstacle of an antagonist. That's not an obstacle of someone out there moving against the priest. Instead, this priest has an internal obstacle that he is looking to deal with and to mitigate through. So that's what we want to see in our first fall. In our first fall, we're also going to need to understand what will lift this character up to try again. Why will this character attempt to do this again? And again, this is an imitation of life. What motivates us to go again? What motivates us to try again? What we're going to see in the upward slope of the arc is that this is where backstory is established and comes into play. Backstory can be anything that's going to give us some element of the story that happened back before this particular story. That's why it's called backstory.